Today I'm here with Cleve Lightfoot. Cleve has spent 33 years in the mining industry. 25 years of those have been here in Chile, where he's led the teams of innovation technology for Tier 1 miners. Today we're going to hear from Cleve a little bit about his experience in the mining industry. Thank you for joining us, Cleve. Really appreciate it. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your history and your background and your experience.
Thanks for the invite, Cody, and really happy to have this opportunity to experience or share my experiences. Originally born in South Africa, I studied metallurgical engineering, initially worked in South Africa in the gold industry, and then went into the project world. Interestingly enough, I've always had a thread of technology implementation, certainly in those first years, initially on mine sites, but then through major projects. After South Africa, I went and worked in Ghana, then projects in Uzbekistan, working out of the UK, spent some time in Australia and Perth, working in the nickel industry, before coming to Chile to actually help Codelco get across the line with a JV with BHP to test bioleaching technology for copper concentrates. And then I chose to stay, and so that was, as you said, 25 years ago.
Wow.
With BHP, I was very fortunate that besides being sent around the world and experiencing different aspects of mining, I ended up spending a lot of time in innovation and technology over the last 25 years. And a lot of innovation and technology is about really truly understanding what the future requires, where we are today, where the gaps are, how to structure the problem in the right way so we can pursue it, and then finding ways of actually doing it, or solving or coming up with a set of solutions. And unlike in engineering, where normally there's one solution, really what we need to look at is generate options for the industry. Particularly when we're going into areas of unknown like decarbonisation, water. We're really looking at an industry which largely hasn't changed much over the last 100 years, certainly from the technology we use. Yes, the toys are bigger and a little bit more sophisticated, but they're still largely trucks, shovels, mills, flotation heaps and things like that. And we need to change that to be relevant in a future sustainable world.
Absolutely. And your experience a lot is from a Tier 1 miner's perspective, which is different than from being from a service provider. So I'm curious to know from your experience, what is driving the adoption of technology in the mining industry right now?
Well, the key thing which has changed over the last, I'd say even as close as 25 to 30 years, are the concepts around environment, sustainability and governance. So the community have developed a voice which, if we want to maintain our license to operate, has to be dealt with. So community is big. And you say, well, how does mining impact on community? Well, there's things like dust, there's tailing storage facilities which sit in many people's backyards. So the tech around that is, well, how can we not build traditional tailings storage facilities? How can we put dry material out there in a different form? How can we find other uses for tailings? How can we monitor tailings facilities so that people can actually understand what's happening in real time of what's sitting in their backyard, particularly in places like Chile, where we are a seismic country, and after every earthquake or tremor, what is the status of that tailing facility? I think after that, then decarbonisation is big. Decarbonisation means we need to be more efficient, but we also need to figure out how do we actually hack our concentrators, well, basically all our processes. So, how do we go from a diesel-driven truck and shovel operation to an all-electric? And that drives a whole lot of things: electric drive trucks, how you put in the infrastructure to actually provide that energy. Safety continues to be big. So, we've really seen anti-collision rollout. We've really seen, well, the next level after anti-collision is obviously autonomous, and autonomy has come a huge way, both in drills and in trucks. And so that's been a big win from a safety point of view. There's anti-fatigue. And then you get into productivity. And productivity is how can we get more out of what we've got, particularly out of our resource where the value actually lies. How we can do that with generations which are coming into mining which don't really want to sit on a mine site, where there has been an almost sort of unlearning of some of the experience with people retiring and more mine sites on and demanding more people. So this becomes a place ripe for sensors, advanced process control, and artificial intelligence.
And so from what I'm hearing from you is that this drive of technology isn't so much about the bottom dollar, it's about stakeholders, it's about the community, it's about the environment, it's about doing things in a better way.
At the end of the day, you need to do both, because the stakeholders, depending on what hat they're wearing, they want value. I think it's just the way we look at value. Value today is not just a dollar sign. It is quality of life, impact on life, sustainability. And ultimately what you need to look at is all of those things combined. So not only do I want something which, a decarbonized mine, for example, but it also needs to be sustainable financially. In other words, generate revenue.
Absolutely. And so right now what we've seen is a lot of different technology companies are moving in the whole world, but coming to Latin America, and they're trialing new technologies. And I wanted, from your perspective, what are some of the weaknesses that these companies need to understand that the mining companies, they might not have the skills or the tools in certain areas? Could you speak to maybe some of the things that they should know or understand when they're trialing new technologies?
I'd maybe take a step before that, Cody. At a higher level, to me, there's multiple actors, right? And if we look at the two principal actors, it will be the technology supplier or vendor and the operator. So the person on the ground actually producing is responsible for that sustainable production. Now, there exists an asymmetry of experience and knowledge between those two groups. So the very first thing a technology supplier needs to know is what value or what pain am I coming to solve? And is that amongst the top priorities of who I'm working with? Because we're already working in an industry which is full of risk. So the way the mining industry would look at it, certainly from the operator side, is, well, I'm adding more risk to a basket which is already full of risk. So the big thing is, well, I need to get confidence not just in the technology, but also the people who are custodians of that technology or owners of that technology, that I'm not adding risk, unknown risk to this basket already. But the first piece on how do you align and deal with that asymmetry means that there's a human piece which you need to do there, and an organizational piece. There needs to be conversations which can be quite iterative to make sure you're working on the right thing. If you don't get that right, everything else is just heartache. Once you've got that lined up, then I think it becomes a lot easier, but you need to make sure there's lots of things which line up there. The contract piece needs to capture the spirit of what you're trying to do. You need to be fairly generous around the timings, because if something's new, your technology might be well known, but you're working in an environment, and this is independent of whether you're in Chile or anywhere else, you're in a mine site environment which is different. And to be quite honest, the replication from one mine site to another mine site, the plug and play piece just doesn't exist. So each replication or scale is slightly different. And you need to be generous in time and expectations around that for that to happen. But that's not just from you as a supplier. It also needs to be reciprocated with your client. So the whole concept of how do you co-develop your test work, how you identify what your KPIs and things like that are, is absolutely critical. Because if you don't get your expectations set up in the beginning, it's just going to lead to frustration later on.
And something you had mentioned is that within a mining company, you have operational staff, you have other staff that are part of, for example, innovation technology groups, and you have priorities of a head office or that come from abroad. And so how do we manage these different stakeholders? Because each one has something that they want or they expect. Would you have any advice as to how you can manage?
I would start off by saying that when I was in tier one miners, I was like, my clients were also on the production side because I was looking after technology and innovation.
Yeah.
So outsiders from the tech and supply space were experiencing things which I was also experiencing, which quite often they don't recognize. So I like to think I can speak from a certain amount of authority with that. If you don't have the site leadership on board on something, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Because they are ultimately responsible for delivery of a product. You might have co-accountability because you, for example, putting in the technology, but your success is going to depend on them. Innovation teams and other corporate groups, you need to engage and ensure that they are on board. Because if they're not on board, they're going to add white noise to the relationship. And ultimately, to be successful, you're going to, and say if you've got a digital product, you're going to need a technology function or an IT function on board with you for it to be enabled. Because none of the things we're really dealing with are just owned by a single individual. There's a pot of multiple people. And that probably brings me to the element which, as an industry, we do really, really poorly, and that is change management. I think where the industry has done it well is in mine haulage, the automation of that. Yeah. Particularly in operations which have been going concerns, because they could not afford any hiccup in the changeover because of production. So there's been very strong change management around that. Ultimately, what we need to do is take that change management and move it into all the projects, independent of whether they're small or big, for them to have a better chance to go somewhere. And that change management is not just on the operator level. You need change management which is tiered for the different levels in the hierarchy. It needs to deal with the why. It needs to be able to give tools to the people. It needs to educate them if education is required to be able to operate, well, commission and operate afterwards. You need to have understandings around things like how are roles going to change. So for example, if you're rolling out, let's say, an artificial intelligence solution, someone which is now basically taking decisions for you, previously the operator would be taking those decisions. Now, first of all, you're going to get resistance from the operator because you're taking something away from him or her. But what you're really doing is that operator now needs to be a data controller or data owner, best said. And the supervision needs to become a data steward, because the quality of the decisions in artificial intelligence is dependent on the data.
Exactly.
But who writes those role descriptions? Who helps with that? Who explains to the operator or the supervisor that these things need to change, and the KPIs along with that change as well? So that needs to be part of the change management. And personally, just sticking on change management for a while, the client, the operations group need to own the change management. But the vendor needs to come there with the content to be able to supply to the change manager and say, this is the content which is required. This is the impact which is going to happen with your jobs. These are the tools which they're going to have to learn to use. These are the education pieces and the training pieces which are required. And it's really a question of having that good conversation around accountability of that right up front, so people are crystal clear on how that's going to play out.
I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. what exactly is change management? When we talk about change management from a vendor's perspective, how can they add to that conversation? How can they come in with inside their proposals a good change management program? And how can they really make sure that their technology is going to be used properly and used on an ongoing basis?
Well, just teasing out some of the last things I said. So they need to help the client with the why.
Yeah.
The training and education materials they understand their product.
Yeah.
So they need to provide that as content and then work with the supplier, or not the supplier, the actual client, so the two can then converge into a piece around training and a schedule of how you would actually train those people.
Sorry, I wanted to dig in. So you would actually recommend that they create like a schedule of training and getting the right people?
And you would supply the content.
Perfect, okay.
Okay. Obviously, the client puts the contextual stuff because it's their operation. A good example of this, for example, autonomous haulage.
Yeah.
There's about 400 hours per operator for training. Now you can't get a driver out and do 400 hours in a classroom. So there's some classroom, but most of it's on the job. And so you also need to look at balancing that and make recommendations. Excuse me. Tools, I think, is probably a bit easier because that normally goes accompanying the tech which you are going to roll out. You make recommendations around things like job descriptions, which will be able to support the client. The client obviously owns the roles and the role descriptions, but they need to understand what the impact's going to be, if there is at all. Being sort of continuous improvement problems. Some of those still exist today, which I and other colleagues worked on in the last 20, 25 years. So you have to ask yourself why they're recurring. And I think a lot of them are recurring for two reasons. One, I think the very manual operating system which we've got is unsustainable for those type of solutions. We need to re-platform into like a digital platform to actually start having sustainable solutions around that. And that's going to be vital if we want to become green mining and things like that in the future. And the other thing is because there hasn't been follow through for a certain amount of time by the supplier. Because you need to make sure that people truly understand it, they're using it correctly, it becomes sticky and it stays sticky.
And so we're seeing a lot of companies coming from Australia, Europe, Canada, North America. Even more particular, I've seen in the last probably 2 years, there's a lot more companies coming from California and from outside mining who are now bringing technologies to the industrial sectors. And so this part of change management is being able to speak with the operations team. It's about being able to work with them. And so in your mind, how important is, if you're going to enter the Chilean market, is to have like a local team that speaks Spanish? How big of, when you're choosing different suppliers or to provide something, how big of a deal is that they have those local?
I think it's absolutely critical. Because beyond language, there's also a cultural component of how you approach, and it's not just Chile or that. There's a great book called Culture Mapping, I think it is, where it actually shows how different cultures engage at different sort of levels, and then obviously when you start mixing cultures, how they can actually think they're speaking the same thing, but actually be speaking something totally different. So having people who can actually translate that and be able to land it. So one is on a national level, and then the other one is obviously being able to speak the language of operations. So I've been on a digital journey for probably about 14, 15 years now. Yeah. I'm certainly not a digital native. I'm still constantly exposed to new terms and things like that. The problem is that quite often if you use that jargon in front of like a digital type jargon in front of a mining operator, they're not going to understand anything. So being able to to translate what you're trying to do into simple language so people can really understand it, and understand what miners listen to, particularly value. How's this going to impact on you? What value is it going to create? What pain is it going to take away? And be very crystal clear around the business and the impact rather than the tech. And quite often we can get blindsided by the tech and get caught up in the technology to a level which just makes the other party's eyes roll.
Exactly. And so a lot of what we see is we're coming to Chile, we're going to hire people. Do you think it's important to have people that have worked on site and understand that operational culture, or do you think an outsider can come in and still work in the same?
I think you need a mix.
Yeah.
I think you at least need someone who understands that operations environment. The very first benefit which you get is that the client is going to see that, and immediately there will be a level of empathy which otherwise you wouldn't have.
Exactly.
And that empathy will give a certain amount of confidence and standing to that individual and the company which that individual represents.
Very, very, very interesting. Right now, what we're seeing is that the skills required for mining are changing. And as we move towards more digital, more technology, we're seeing a different skill set that is needed. In your opinion, within the mining companies, is there certain areas that they're lacking in skills that suppliers should understand, that maybe they're going into an environment that the mining companies might not have that much strengths,
Well, I think the challenge which we've got is that most mid to senior leadership continues to be not, if you're thinking digital, not digital natives.
Yeah.
So there is a nut to crack there. The younger generations and the generations who actually you're going to be working with, I think the language is going to be easier, but the decision makers are going to be in that space. So that's probably the biggest thing which you need to take on. The other piece is, and it feeds from the first one, is, well, we've got lots of data in mining. Outside the sort of resource data, which is well organized because of legal compliance, JORC, etc., reporting requirements, the other data is not isn't accessible, is not well structured, and can't be dealt with. And so being able to have whether this is not really a skill, but really having the foresight to say, well, look, there's an infrastructure piece I need to bite off. Yeah. And I can do it small, or I can just go big bang, doesn't matter which approach you take. But I need to order that data. And I see there's been a reluctance, there's an understanding that needs to be done, but when the numbers come in on how much that's going to cost, I see that there's been a certain amount of reluctance to go in there. But then I also think on the tech side, it's been relatively naive in thinking that, well, we'll just get this because it's important. And that's where you need a convergence. So I think it's, rather than specific skills, it's probably more a convergence of generations, and there's conversations which need to happen about that. Just anecdotally, I sat in on a talk around the skills required for a future workforce a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I looked around the table and I said, so we had good diversity, gender diversity, and I said, out of interest, who over here is younger than 40? 2 people put up their hands. Said, who is here younger than 35? No one put up their hand. Yeah. And so I said, okay, we're talking about the future workforce, but we don't actually have anyone representing that future workforce. So I think there are things which all companies can do at the end of the day when they have to take on this question is, can we get the right demographic around the table to have a good conversation around that? and not just have a more theoretical conversation around what's required.
And that's a global conversation that's happening right now. That's not just in Chile, that's happening in Australia, that's happening in Canada. How do we get more young people involved? Because maybe the way that we looked at mining was a completely different way than what it's going to. And so I'm very interested because you've worked in, you started obviously in South Africa, you moved to Australia, you've been to Chile. I'm sure you've traveled around to many different sites with different miners that you've worked with. I'm curious to you, what are some of the cultural things that maybe a foreigner needs to know when they come to Chile that is maybe different than outside? Could be something basic or it could be something...
No, the simple one is the Chilean culture is very social, so they don't like people coming and telling them what to do. And I think that's unfair to tell people what to do. There's a very strong and long mining history here. They operate the world's biggest mines. Yep. What we call big miners here are really gigantic miners on the world stage, relative to other countries. So the command and control is not something which works in the Chilean culture. It is about socializing, getting a message through socializing heavily with empathy. So, to me, we can resolve a lot if we had a lot more empathy on all sides.
Someone once told me, he said their goal when they come to Chile is to be invited to a barbecue. And they said if you can get invited to a barbecue, then you're in. And so that speaks to that social aspect.
Yeah, and it's not about having a good time. It's about developing a relationship before you move forward. And I come from South Africa. There's a very similar culture there, and I think that's why me living here and that I find it relatively easy because there is that social element. Whereas if you would go to other anglicized countries, it can be quite different.
One of the things I wanted to get into is because some of the things that you've been working here in Chile is with angel investment and acting as an advisor to different technology companies. And when I arrived to Chile 12 years ago, there was definitely a supplier base around technology, but it was very local. You didn't see a lot of technologies that were the next stage that could be exported. But what I've noticed the last 5 years is that this has really changed in Chile. There's a lot of new and up and coming companies that now have solutions that are not only good for Chile, but are also good for the world. And they're actually starting to move into Australia. And that was something that's honestly, in my opinion, has changed in the last 5 years. I'm curious to you what you're seeing from that aspect, from the local technology and what is potentially coming out to the world.
Yeah, look, that journey I think started around about 2005 when the administration of the day, this is the country administration, the government of the day said, we're going to put a royalty on mining, yep. And that's going to go into driving innovation. And I think mining have stepped into that space, and if you look at BHP, Codelco, Collahuasi, Antofagasta Minerals, I think Teck's there as well. They're using a lot of more open innovation, using Foundation Chile, and they expand their area as a way of publishing problems so they can actually look at getting external solutions to see how they can resolve that. That was unmentionable in the past. And it's a journey, but it's not just happening in mining. I went to an event recently, I can't remember what it's called, but the amount of companies which have got their own little corporate ventures going, the amount of startups and that is absolutely incredible, and you wouldn't have seen that even 10 years ago. So the growth in that space is tremendous. Obviously, from a government point of view, there's been a lot of pressure on mining to do things differently, being the major revenue provider to the government's coffers. And I think that's right as well, because how do you take an industry which is not sustainable and use that to actually finance things which can help a country grow? And it's still fairly timid if you look at against the other OECD countries and that, but it's better than it was a year ago. Yeah. It's certainly better than it was 5 years ago, so it means we're on the right trajectory. a few years ago, there was a study which came out, just to complement what you said, where Santiago actually had, on a city level, the highest concentration of startups in the mining industry. And that was higher than Melbourne and Brisbane and that, so on a city level. Country level, Australia and Canada and places that were slightly superior. So we're doing something right there. Unfortunately, it's still really difficult for startups, Chilean startups, to engage well with mining companies in Chile. Sometimes they have more success actually engaging in other countries, and that's just part of the. Well, I think I know what the problem is. I think the problem is because we've got gigantic miners. Yeah. The step is too big from a scale point of view. I think if we look at the met sector in Australia, they grew rapidly because there's a lot of small and medium companies going through their different metal cycles and employment and disemployment. There's a lot of people who had knowledge and ideas, and they went in and developed those as part of, and that grew the met sector. There's not very much engagement for small and medium here. Everything points to the big companies. But as I said, they're gigantic, they're not big, and I think it's a bridge too far.
Absolutely. And so if a supplier shows up and you were to give a couple pieces of advice to someone who had never been to Latin America, never been to Chile, but had a good piece of technology and wanted to enter the market, what would be the first couple things that you might mention to them as advice to them just getting into the market?
Well, beyond understanding what they can offer, I think the most important thing is working on their pitch to engage with potential clients. So what is their product? What impact can it have? How things will be different and better afterwards given that impact? And then what's the business model? So that in terms of the pitch, the narrative or storytelling which needs to accompany that. The other one then would be to be very open and clear or transparent with them around the difficulties. Yeah. So one, obviously I can connect them with the right people, but then two is don't expect immediate response. The question set you really need to do is, rather than say, look, this is what I've got to offer, but really tell me what your pain points are. Because in many ways you want the client to feel that they are leading this. Yeah. And you want to have a pull situation where the client is pulling you're not pushing your product on them. Obviously you need a bit of both, but if you get into a pull situation where the client is actually asking you, you've won 90% of the battle.
Absolutely. No, that's amazing. Kind of coming to the end of our interview, which has been very, very interesting to get your perspective. I wanted to ask you, where do you see the industry going over the next 5 years here in Chile? Do you see specific areas that are going to be more focused on than other areas? The mining industry in general has been going through some changes the last year or two, and it'd be interesting just to hear your perspective of where you think it's going.
Well, I think most of the big mine sites will be autonomous, certainly on the mine side. Yeah. Drills and trucks. There needs to be significant work in the water and energy side. So, there's really been the quick fix of, well, let's get green contracts. Yeah. But ultimately, what needs to happen is we need to, through smart grids, AI, things like that, they really need to work on both water and energy efficiencies as a way of shrinking that. To meet well, I guess the problem is when you've got a green contract, it takes the focus of actually driving down or working on efficiencies. But efficiencies hit your pocket right away because it's cost, right? The next generation of tailing storage facilities, be them brownfield expansions and green, they're going to have to be non-conventional just because of what legislation is saying and the expectation, certainly at a community level. over here. There's still a gap which needs to work on that. Ultimately, what needs to happen is miners need to look at the system which produces tailings so they can get a better tailings, which gives you more options for non-conventional deposition, which means that you have to get into the heart of that. So you need to have a different milling circuit, a different flotation setup. That needs to be, but that's not going to happen within that time frame. I think, but hopefully there'll be enough studies in that to show that for the next 5 years, there'll be something which comes out of that. I think the next logical step after automation is how we start automating decisions. And that's a step up in advanced process control and more artificial intelligence solutions running, not just over certain areas of the value chain, but ultimately across the whole value chain. And more importantly than anything, linking it back into the resource. Ultimately, the resource is where the value lies. The moment we start scratching the ground, we start losing value. So this is all about how can we preserve value between the ground and getting it to our client. And the decisions which go into actually taking out the variability in that and squeezing closer and closer to the theoretical optimum can only be done by machines. It can't be done by us. It's just not sustainable anymore. So yeah, big move on ESG, and then I think a big move in terms of productivity through the automation of decisions.
Interesting. Well, thank you, Cleve, so much for your time. You've contributed so much in your time here in Chile, and I'm very excited to see how your career plays out and the different companies that you work with. So thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cody.